We are going through this series on Ephesians. In fact, this is the next to the last. And then next week, we will wrap up this series. And I hope you've been blessed by it. I hope you've been challenged by it. But the part that we come to today is so appropriate for Mother's Day because it talks about parenting and some of those relationships. So if you have your, I want you to open to Ephesians chapter 6. Ephesians chapter 6. And if there's something else that I need to be doing with my microphone, Scott, just let me know. Ephesians chapter 6 is the part where, just a quick review, where we talk about the household codes. And this is the concept that what Paul is doing is he's speaking into something that's already established in culture. And it's this how to form out your household. How does that basic building block of society work? And Paul is going to do two things. He's going to adopt that system, but then he's going to adapt it counterculture to the world with what it means to do that in the name of Christ. And so we would very much be on board and say, yes, the family's the building block. The family, what happens in the household, has everything determined with how our culture goes. And so Paul's going to take that, and what he's going to do, though, is he's going to now bring in the revelation of Jesus, and what does it look like to fall under the lordship of Jesus, even in how we organize our houses. So if you have your Bibles, I'm going to jump right back into chapter 5, because this establishes here's how we are to grow our families. Verse 21 in chapter 5, and if you haven't underlined that one yet, then I want you to read that quietly to yourself while we change out microphones. And we're back. Okay. Paul says that in the church, and remember, every time he says you, he actually means what? Y'all. Us together. So he says, you submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. This phrase alone was radical. This phrase alone would have been scandalous because that's not how their households were built. What they did is the dad, the master, was large and in charge. And everybody just ruled under his thumb. And all the contemporary codes that we've come across, particularly from Aristotle, right to the fact they all teach the family how to be ruled over by the patriarch, how to be controlled by the patriarch. And so when he comes along and says, when Paul says, yes, the household matters, so he adopts that from culture or agrees with that from culture, but then he adapts it by saying, but it matters differently because what you do is you submit to one another. And last week we talked about marriage. And we ended with this idea that an awake marriage, meaning a one that's been fully revealed in Jesus, is nothing short of a submission competition between two parties that are trying to serve one another. And then Paul continues this thought, and now he goes into children. So I'm going to preach on some parenting from Paul. Let me tell you, I don't preach thinking that I'm some kind of expert on it. I am grateful for the kids that Erica and I have and the people that they have grown to be. But this is not Scott's, here's 10 commandments on here's how to raise your kids perfectly. It's not even 10 suggestions on how to raise your kids perfectly. It perhaps is a few tips that may work for some parents in some situations in some parts of the country. Perhaps yours. But what we can rely on is what Paul is teaching us in the Word of God. And so, with submit to one another as our framework, look with me, we're going to work our way through the 9 verses in chapter 6. He starts this way. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you, that you may live long in the land. Paul starts out addressing children. One note here. is that children usually were not even addressed in documents like this. So Paul is already bringing them into the conversation, and he has instructions for them. Notice how it says, children, obey your parents. Then it says, in the Lord. So, this is the part that's for everybody. Okay? Or I think this should be for everybody. We'll do a quick survey. If you either currently are, or at one time in your life, you were a child, raise your hand. Okay, that's most of you. Okay, great. So this is going to apply. What Paul is saying is, I want you to obey your parents, and that's pretty straightforward. I want you to respect their role and the authority that they have over you. Then he adds this, in the Lord. Here's what that doesn't mean. He doesn't mean obey your parents if they're Christians. He doesn't say just simply the Christians. What he's saying is, and he's saying to children of all ages, which is all of us, that we are to obey our parents in the Lord. Why? Because that is how we show that we are followers of the Lord. We obey because we realize that we do submit to a higher authority. We submit to one that we call Lord, and it is in this obeying of our parents that we are now showing and demonstrating our fellowship of Jesus. So I'm just going to suggest that it's really, really difficult for you to be in rebellion to your parents. I don't mean just a disagreement, but in rebellion to your parents and following Jesus. What Paul is saying is as you follow Jesus, then what you will do is you will find ways to be in submission to those that are structured around you and those that are looking for your best. And so, kids of all ages, I'm going to encourage this. He just says straight up, obey your parents. This is honor your father and mother. And he's quoting from the 10 Commandments. And so Paul is reaching all the way back and says this has been God's plan all along. And he adds this is the first commandment with the promise. And if you go back and you read the 10 Commandments, when you go through them and you get to this one, the other ones are thou shalt not, thou shalt not. And then you hit this one, says honor. And then it has this promise that if you do this, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Well, understand this you is a y'all also. It goes, this is how, if you want to thrive as a culture, if you want to thrive as a people, live this out. And what Paul is encouraging them to do is because Paul is introducing something really radical, that somebody would be submissive by choice, would come under another authority by choice, and everybody that's on the outside of the church, they look at that and they think, that is going to take apart the whole system. It's all going to come crumbling down. And he says, no, this way we will find security and strength, and together we come together and serve this. And so Paul is making a very important point here. But to you that are old enough to where you have some say now in your relationship with your parents, here's what I'm going to encourage you with. And I'm talking to our younger people. That I want you to understand on behalf of your parents, and I'll put the caveat, your parents did not ask me to say this, but they will agree with me when I say it. I want you to cut us some slack because they're doing the best they can with what they have. And you have to understand, I would often joke early on, I can so clearly remember that first drive home from the hospital when my son, who now yesterday graduated from college, I remember that drive home, though, that first day that now we're parents. And it was the slowest drive I ever took in my life. Because now I had a baby on board. And I remember thinking that as we walked out of the hospital, I was just floored that they let me walk out with this human life. Like, we just walked out the door. Nobody stopped us. Nobody came running after us and said, here's the instruction manual. And then I realized that if they had provided the instruction manual, we never would have got into the project to begin with. And so your parents, and you may have some disagreements with them, but I want you to be graceful back to them as a way to honor them with an understanding that they are doing what they can. They are working to serve you in a way that God has called them to. They are not perfect. And as parents, we try to become perfect, don't we? We want to be the perfect parent, but we struggle with that. And we have to come to acknowledge at some point when we realize that we're not the perfect parent, and our kids could probably do a whole lot better off with someone else as their parent. But the children, I want you to understand that. I want you to understand they are on your behalf. And so what I would say for you, that I think this teaching that Paul has for this is this slide right here. Honoring your parents may need to begin with forgiving your parents. There may be something, some gap, some disappointment, some wound, some lacking in their raising you up, that if they could go back and turn back the clock, they would do it differently this time. But they didn't have a second run at it, because we don't get second runs that way, second chances that way. And as part of your honoring, that you may need to spend some time working through and praying your way through something where you can come and forgive them. I'm not diminishing whatever the wound was. I'm not suggesting it's not a real wound. I'm not suggesting that at all. But if you're going to live this out in submission and honoring like Christ calls us to, then perhaps for you, the message today is it needs to begin with you coming to a place of forgiveness with your parents, acknowledging that they were not perfect. Because here's the truth, neither are you. And neither did that come your way. And this is part of the reason that we don't submit because they deserve it. We don't honor them because they've earned it. We submit and we serve and we honor. Why? Because Jesus has. And out of lordship to him, we find a way to forgive. Because that's what Jesus did to us. You did not earn the forgiveness that Jesus brings to you. And yet he freely brings it to you. So perhaps that's part of your message today. You spend some time forgiving your parents. And honestly, this is possible whether they're still living or not. Second part goes on. Paul writes on. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in discipline and instruction of the Lord. This says fathers because he's adopting the parental code of the day. It would better read parents for us today. Parents, do not provoke your children to anger, because you know they're provoking you, right? But there is a very clear provoke your children to anger. Once again, and when Paul wrote it, provoking your children to anger, that was not seen as something negative. Because if you call the shots, and it's an honor-shame society. Remember that. And so if you have a child that's not honoring the father, then that brings shame on him, and therefore that's embarrassing to him. I mean, that's egregious to him, and so he can push back with all means and force and authority possible. And what Paul is doing is says, don't lead that way. That may be the way that others do. That may be the way the culture does. But remember, 5:21, we're in submission to one another. Do not provoke your children. I spent a lot of time wrestling with this word. What does it mean to provoke our kids to anger? And I thought of some ways, and this is where I'll get to just what some practical perspective, I think. And this is not by any means a complete list. But some of the ways, those of us as parents, that we have a tendency to start provoking our kids, the way we may build up resentment from our children. Here's just a couple of things that I reflected on. One, when we try to live our lives again through them. When whatever it is, whatever glory that we had or we thought we missed out on, or whatever we thought we deserved, and we try to live it back through them, where we expect them to make all the accomplishments that we failed at, that we didn't accomplish, or they can't jump as high as us and run as fast as us, or whatever it is, that we put these pressures and these demands on them. That's a way to provoke. Another way to provoke is we get so caught up, and can we just be honest for a second, and we won't let it leave the room, okay? Can you think of another effort or project that you feel more judged in than parenting, right? Because we've all done it, right? You know, either it's your kid that you're embarrassed about, or you're looking across the way at somebody else is going, yep, I'm embarrassed for them, right? And that's just, that almost seems like it comes with it. And we're so judgy when it comes to parenting, because we think that we can be perfect at it, but obviously nobody's perfect at it. And so then what happens is we get offended when our kids embarrass us, right? And we put undue amounts of pressure on our kids, not simply because they're misbehaving or for their own good or whatever, but because we're embarrassed. And then the volume goes up, and the screaming goes up, and the yelling goes up. And we struggle with that. But that's the way we provoke when my self-worth starts becoming defined by my children. Now, I'm not saying we don't take joy in our children and pride in our children, but my self-worth is all on the line. And that puts undue pressure. For what you may struggle then with the outgrowth of that is, now we have these expectations on our kids that are not well articulated. They're vague because they're really based on my emotions of the given moment and my hopes and dreams and expectations that you're going to live out, because I've got some failures in my life and I think you can do better, and then I can kind of live through that. And so now I am pushing you, but I'm pushing you with expectations that are always going to be moving, and you're always going to fall short, or I'm always going to withhold the blessing at the right moment because I think I can get a little bit more out. We don't plan on doing this. We fall into it. Or perhaps you've got the one where the consequences are never clear and they're always changing and they're always difficult to define. My mom had a phrase every time my brother got in trouble or did something to me that made me upset. Her warning was this: next time you're going to get a spanking. I was like, Mom, there never is a next time. You know, because the warning just kept coming and coming and coming. And so these are things that we do with expectations. But I think probably the strongest one is when we don't live our lives vulnerably and transparently in front of our kids, where we hold them to standards that we don't even hold ourselves to. And they see the hypocrisy and they see the thing. And it's okay to have a high standard for your kids. I'm not saying that. But when we act like we're also 100% on that standard, instead of saying to our children, bringing them in and saying, this is the values of our family, this is the values of how we're going to live, this is what we're going to, we fall short of it, you're going to fall short of it, but together we're going to work towards these values. And us be willing to even say, I'm sorry, when need be. And say, I failed, I messed up, and be transparent with that. And invite them into that. This is what, when Paul says that we do not provoke them, but we do something instead, we bring them up in discipline and instruction of the Lord. So what we are doing is we're leading them in faith and we're discipling our children, and it begins at home. We're showing them how to live this God-centered, Jesus-following life. And so, yeah, there are values and there are expectations. But at the same time, we have to show them that we're on that same journey with them of making Jesus Lord and living that out. So there may be some times you simply need to be to your kids, how can I serve you today? How can I help you in this? But if we get caught up in it all being about the expectations and the rules, then what we do is we start sending a message that says, follow the rules is the number one important thing to us. And that begins to damage relationship. And so, what I would say, what Paul is teaching us, in the light of Jesus, and we use this phrase, fully awake, because that's what Ephesians is about, us awakening to this reality of Jesus. A fully awake parenting is this. Fully awake parent places relationship above the rules. For those of you with kids still at home, I want to encourage you with this. One of your jobs is to raise the kids in such a way that they still want to be around you when they don't have to be around you. Okay? And I'm not saying you don't have rules. I'm not saying you don't have expectations. I'm not saying you are not training them up in a certain kind of life. But it is all built on and is led by the relationship with you. They need to know that they may be able to break a rule, but they can never, ever break the relationship. And why can I say that so strongly and passionately? Because that is exactly the kind of relationship that God has with us. This is the same God, the same Jesus that tells a story when everybody's crowded in around him and says, tell us more about what God the Father's like. And he says, I'll tell you what God the Father's like. He's like a dad that had two sons. And one of his sons, the younger one, did an incredibly horrible thing. He shows up, gets in the dad's face and says, Dad, I wish that you were dead. So can we pretend like you're dead and just let me take my inheritance now? And then he takes that money and he goes off and he lives a life of just repugnant immorality. Totally eschewing any rule that the household had. And when he goes to the very bottom and he starts his long trek home, he practices his homecoming speech that says, Dad, I am not worthy to be a son. I'm not worthy of a relationship anymore. But I will work to reestablish the rules. Make me a servant and I will go to work for you. And when he tops over the hill, Dad, who's been on the front porch every evening praying to see his son, sees him, leaps off the porch and runs to him And even though the son is in mid-sentence of his speech, the father throws his arms around him and he hugs him and he kisses him and he welcomes him home because he was lost and now relationship is restored. That's what God does for us. A fully awake parent always puts the relationship above the rules. Yes, there are rules, but you cannot break the relationship. So I would encourage you with this, and this one's going to seem strange, but back right in 5:21, if you look right back up above that list, Paul says, here's 4 things you're going to know about the manifestation of Spirit. We're going to sing to one another songs and hymns. We're going to make melody in our hearts. We're going to be grateful and praise. And then he says, submit to one another. So, all of those, every one of them is in the context of this worship experience. So this continues throughout the whole deal. So I know this is going to seem weird, but here's the next thing. Fully awake parenting is worship. Now, some days it's a praise song and some days it's a lament. I get it. But here's what I want to encourage you with. When you're in the middle of it and none of it is feeling good right then, when you feel like you're at your very wit's end with your children, and it's one more difficult day after one more difficult day, and you're still trying to get the shoes on and get everybody out the door, and nothing's going right, that's worship. That is what is occurring right there. And that doesn't make all the frustration go away, but if I can just reframe it for you, because that's what Paul is doing for us, that if there's a moment there you can say, God, I am worshiping you here. This is why some of my greatest heroes are single moms. Because you are working extra hard and you're getting your kids here. And some days it's storming outside. And it's tough and it's difficult and you're tired, yet you're still working to have them in relationship with the community of faith, be tied into church, be a part of it. And there's a worship that is occurring in that moment that starts long before you sing the first song once you get here. And that worship takes place on Tuesdays and it takes place on Thursdays and around dinner tables and even when you're trying to get homework done. Because again, he says, sing to one another. Make melody in your hearts. Give thanks always. And submit to one another. And all of that guides with this. And so fully awake parenting, you're worshiping as you go. And I want you to be energized and encouraged by that. Well, then he shifts gears. And we'll just touch on this last one very quickly. He goes into something that may seem a little strange to us, but he says, bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ. Not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man. Knowing that whatever good anyone does this, he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. So he addresses one side of the equation, the relationship, the bondservant, the slave. Then he says, masters, do the same thing to them. Stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. Now again, if you were in that culture, this is turning the culture upside down. Because there's no reason that a master should ever have to stop threatening their slave. No. Quick aside. Paul is not endorsing the slavery that we're familiar with in this country, the chattel slavery that we experienced. This truly is, the word bondservant is a good translation because what it is, it's more of a contractual indebtedness type servant. It's less about an ownership and more about coming into working off debt, working off things. So it falls more aligned with the employer-employee type relationship than it does with the slavery one as we visualize it in our country. So what Paul is saying is that he's saying to these bondservants, when you work, I want you to work, I want you to serve in submission to your master, but you now realize I'm not in submission to him, I'm in submission to Jesus, and so therefore my work will reflect that. And to the masters, this is not simply because you hold all the power anymore. This turns it upside down on its head. It says, no, you're now also in submission, remember 5:21, in submission to one another. And so there's this complete flip now that says for those that are following Christ, the old rules no longer apply. There's a new way of doing business here. And so when you enter into these relationships, you're now both seeking to be, once again, in submission to one another because you're both in Christ, and that brings him the glory. So you do not treat your bondservants the way that is simply acceptable by everything else in society. And so now there becomes this redefinition. Can you imagine how different this would have been? Because think about the context that Paul's writing. He's writing to a house church. And they're gathered around, they're reading this, and now it's redefining all these relationships to where now you have probably what is unthinkable before. You could actually have the possibility of a servant in that church that has spiritual giftedness and spiritual maturity becoming an elder with their master being in the church. And so now it seems like it should take it all apart, but because they're in submission to one another trying to serve Jesus, it's strong. So here's what I'm convicted of. That this is one thing that though we don't have bondservants in our homes, we do work and we serve. And so I think Paul would tell us today simply that if you're a follower of Jesus, if you're a Christian, you should be the best employee or the best employer around. Can you imagine what it would be like if the word was out that if you were lucky enough or fortunate enough to hire a Christian for your firm, your office, your garage, your whatever your shop is, that you knew you were hiring an employee that would not ever disappoint you, that would not try to steal from you, would not backtalk, would not try to undercut you from behind. Or if you went to work for a Christian, you thought, this is where I'm going to be cared for and challenged to grow. That should be the standard. And it hurts our witness as Christians that that's not the case all the time. But we can't change everybody else, but we can change us. And so in this time, in this place, we can become the employers and employees, whichever part of that relationship you are, we're going to serve. So the takeaway is this. In all of these relationships, husband, wife, a parent, a child, employee, employer, here's what I want you to ask as you go into this week. In each of these dynamics, whether you're the child or you're the parent, whether the employer or the employee, whether you hold the power or not, I want you to ask, how can I help? How can I help? Some of you as parents, you may never have asked that question before. Some of you as children, you may not have ever asked your parents that question before. How can I help? See, if we were to lead with that and we were to become as a people defined by how can I help, do you see what that would do to change our culture here? There's the challenge for us. this is all based around a family that comes together under a house and acknowledges that Jesus is Lord. And one thing that families do is they eat together. In a few weeks, we're going to have Caden's wedding, and the night before we're going to have the rehearsal dinner. And as part of what I do, I've been involved in numerous rehearsals and rehearsal dinners. There's always the same theme as they go through it. We sit around, we share stories, we laugh, we cry, and memories. And there's this moment of each bride side and groom side saying, we're so glad that we're coming together as a family. Welcome to the family. Well, Jesus gives us that kind of meal together. And we come around this table, symbolically speaking, and we share a meal because we're family. And we share the story. And the story, once again, is that Jesus died for our sins, and then he rose from the grave 3 days later. And we eat and drink and remind ourselves of these things. So that's what we're going to do right now. We have a few of our families that are going to begin. I'm going to ask them to start, and they're going to pass out our communion elements. The Woodrows are part of that, I believe. And they're going to start, and I think the Nash, I think they're a part of that. So they're going to come down to the front right here, and they're going to begin passing out these elements. We're going to sing a song first. And then after that song, Rex Baugh is going to offer our prayer for the bread and then for the cup. And this is us coming together as a family in submission to one another in honor of the Lord, in honor of Christ, because this is his table. And while we do this, I'm going to challenge you to think about a couple things. Maybe your challenge is to think about, how do I need to go about forgiving my parents? Or how do I need to go about forgiving my children? Or perhaps to you, who is it this week that I can ask, how can I help? Because we have a God that stepped out of heaven to help us. If you would, as we prepare, let's sing, and then we'll pray.